All right. Welcome to our next topic in STEM 118. We're going to talk about race and evolution. And to do that, we're going to break this topic down into three short videos. The first talking about evolution and race as not a biological thing, right? So when we really get down to the genetic level, there's no such thing as race. The second part will then talk about race as a very real thing, as a social construct that impacts lives and affects people all the time. And then the third part will be looking at kind of the institutionalization of racism in America. So a little bit of history there to kind of tie things up and kind of move us on to the next topic. So the first question that I want you to ask yourself and think about what comes to mind immediately is when someone says, what is race? What does that mean? And then also, what is evolution? So both of these can be controversial topics. Some of you may have immediate answers, and others may have to think about it some more. And maybe you haven't thought about it at all. So this is a good time if you want to take some notes about these ideas. That's a great time and bring them to discussion in class. But what we're going to do first, kind of when we dive into the idea of biology and skin tone, as most people use that as a big indicator of race. We're going to look at, I want you to look at a video called The Biology of Skin Color. It's wonderfully done. It's about 20 minutes. The link's on the Canvas site. So stop this now, stop my video now and watch the other video. And when you're done with that, you're going to come back and I'll continue on kind of diving into a little bit more on evolution and humans' genetic diversity in general. So now that you've done that, you can see that race is not biologically defined, that skin tone is just one characteristic. There's just a handful of genes controlling that. And so it doesn't make any sense to kind of lump people together into what we call a race based on one small handful of genes, right? You can have individuals that look very similar but can be very different genotypically. And so we're going to see that most of the human diversity on a genotype level actually resides in Africa, because that's where humans came from, right? So let's kind of go over evolution real quick, just so we have some good terms in our head and we're more comfortable with it. And so this is an example of evolution that most intro classes use. This is the idea that the genetic diversity we're going to focus on here in these bugs is a mutation that arises that allows these bugs to be resistant to pesticide. So this is really to illustrate the idea of selective pressure. So it's about individuals interacting with their environment that leads to evolution. And that's a change at a population level. So what we're going to see is this population change over time. If I have a mutation that arises and that red bug is now resistant to the pesticide, it's going to survive, where the green bugs who are not resistant are going to do more poorly. Well, if it survives well and kind of ignores the pesticide, it has a chance to get more food, make more babies, and we see more red bugs now in the population. If that selective pressure continues, it's only going to allow more red bugs to be successful in this environment, and hence we see a shift in the genotype of the population, the gene pool of the population. That is, by definition, evolution. But again, the direction that change occurs in is based on the environment, in this case, the selective pressure of pesticide being present. So what I want you to think about this idea is that if there wasn't pesticide present and this mutation arose, what I forgot to tell you is that that red bug, that mutation, actually makes it really slow. In fact, like its exoskeleton, like it's just really fragile as compared to the green bugs. So if there wasn't that selective pressure at that time, then that red bug probably wouldn't have done very well at all, and we wouldn't have seen it make more babies and have more of its genes in the next generation. But because of that selective pressure, all of a sudden, that's a really big advantage to be like, I can just ignore this pesticide where the rest of you are sick and dying all the time. Now I can get the food with less competition and pass on my genes. So this idea of evolution is very intricately associated with interaction with the environment. So fitness is relative, all right? Now, I keep talking about mutation. And so just to kind of illustrate that mutations are happening all the time, blue eyes are a mutation. Everything about the fact that we don't look exactly the same is the result of mutations in our genome. Now, with 3.1 billion base pairs, You can have a couple mutations and not really change the genome that much, but sometimes those mutations are right in the right spot to have an impact. In this case, we think that the blue-eye mutation arose somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago. I've heard other articles quote closer to 15, but still not that long ago. Before that time, there were no blue-eyed people, right? It didn't exist. And so probably all blue-eyed people come from that one population in which this mutation arose, and they think it's somewhere in the Middle East where the blue-eyed mutation arose, right? So mutants, we all are all mutants, and mutation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's going to be something that maintains diversity in the population, that allows evolution to work. Now, a lot of things that we were talking about, we've simplified and kind of talk about a gene. But in many cases, going back to skin tone as an example, it's many genes that are contributing. And that allows for not just black or white, not just blue or brown, not just one or the other. It allows for that spectrum. So thinking back to our examples and our study of development of human sex, we know that we have male and female, or egg producers and sperm producers, on two ends of the spectrum, but really there's everything in between as we think about intersex. And that's because there's lots and lots of genes that are all interacting, and they can interact differently to create anything anywhere on that spectrum. Same thing with other traits. So if we think about something less complicated, but still pretty complicated, skin tone as opposed to sexual development, we can see that many genes contribute to that, and that allows us to see a huge range of skin tones. So this is from a more recent paper, Adaptations of Human Skin Color in Various Populations, looking at a bunch of those different loci, so a location of a gene, and looking at the different alleles or the different versions of those genes that contribute to skin tone. So you can see we're finding more and learning more about that all contribute to that one characteristic that is so obvious, right? But just one little part of the human phenotype. So just a couple definitions to kind of tie things up and make it neat. Mutations, change in the DNA sequence, right? So if you go back and think about what we talked about and how genes work, remember a gene is instructions to build a protein. And if I change those instructions, the protein's a little different. And that's the difference between whether you get more melanin or less melanin, whether you have brown eyes or blue eyes or whatever color, right? Evolution, genetic change in a population. So as individuals through natural selection are suited to their environment or are able to make more babies, their genes are seen more frequently in the next generation, right? So that's what we call evolutionary fitness. It's not about how strong you are or how sharp your teeth are or anything like that, unless those things are being selected for, unless those are the things that make the difference between you being able to survive and make babies. And that's not always the case. So evolutionary fitness then is measured simply by the number of copies of genes in the next generation. How successful are you at passing on your DNA says to that plant or that rodent or that insect how fit they are evolutionarily. So again, it's about surviving and acquiring resources and then also finding a mate. And so sexual selection and natural selection are going to both be contributing to the evolution of a species. Okay, so that's really fun stuff. And there's a lot of information out there if you want to read more about evolution, natural selection, sexual selection, and all kinds of stuff. Okay, now bringing this back to the human population, we're talking about variation, talking about diversity, and that's really important. The whole idea of sexual selection is there. The whole idea of sexually reproducing is there because it's a wonderful mechanism to maintain diversity. Now, we're going to circle back to that a little bit when we get to ancestry and talk about the idea of meiosis and mixing up your genes before you pass them on to kind of try to maintain diversity in a population, even if you're not seeing mutation. But looking at that variation from a genome level, among humans, we're really not that different. And so when you pick out just one characteristic, it's a false stance to take to try to discriminate between individuals. So again, looking at a flock of penguins, for example, who all look a lot alike, they actually have more genetic diversity than the entire human species, right? And so what this also goes to say is that small changes in humans can reflect more phenotypic difference, or at least phenotypic difference that we pick up than we see in penguins, even though they have a lot more genetic diversity than we do. Right? they're also much older. So penguins, the family that we call penguins, probably started to rise about 70 million years ago. When again, humans are about 200,000 years old. So that's a big difference. But again, focusing on just one characteristic is kind of ludicrous. So that would be like saying, hey, let's look at these vehicles. Are they more similar or not? And saying, oh, all the yellow ones are more similar than all the blue ones. And that's clearly not the case. So you've got construction equipment there. You have cars that are built for speed. You have other things. It's just like just picking out the color there doesn't make any sense if I wanted to start to group these different vehicles, right? And so using skin tone as a grouper as a grouping mechanism for genetic diversity among humans or genetic groups among humans just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So skin color does not indicate genetic relatedness. So again, you can see people with very different skin tones being very closely related, or people that have very similar skin tones and aren't very related at all, right? So you kind of have to throw that one out the window. Again, when we think about humans, we originated in Africa. And it's only because we've moved out across the planet, right? And this is why we're such a weird, we're a great species, a crazy, amazing species, and that we're kind of everywhere, right? We're very successful. But really the biggest wave of humans in recent history came out was about 60,000 years ago. And we think most modern humans are the descent of a small population of humans from about 60,000 years ago. Now, there's also, we'll get into this later as well, we did intermingle with Neanderthals and other individuals of not our species, but our family, right? So not Homo, but other groups, right? And we'll talk about that more when we talk about genotyping and DNA testing kits. But again, this idea that the most genetic diversity that we find among humans is actually among populations in Africa, meaning that I can have two populations of African humans and they can be very, very different, more different than those Africans are to anyone else on the planet. Like, that's the thing. So again, grouping by skin color, not the smart thing to do. So kind of looking at race now as not a biological thing, we know race does impact people. So our next video is going to kind of look at race as a social construct and where that might have come from.